The Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia stretch across the horizon like the spine of a sleeping giant. Fog clings to the valleys. The trees stand ancient and still. And at the end of a dirt road that most maps have forgotten, an old wooden house sits alone beneath a canopy of oak. The paint is peeling. The windows are dark. The porch sags under the weight of decades no one bothered to count. But inside, behind a wall that looks like every other wall, there is a hidden compartment. And inside that compartment, there is a letter, written by a dead woman, addressed to a daughter who does not yet know what she's about to find. 300 miles east, a dark sedan pulls onto the highway. The driver adjusts his tie. His briefcase sits on the passenger seat, initials glinting in the morning sun. He is heading for the same house. He has been waiting for this moment for years. The morning of the will reading dawned colder than usual. Dessa Kincaid opened her eyes after a night of almost no sleep. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, listening to the silence that had settled over her life in the weeks since her mother died. Theda Kincaid had passed only a few weeks earlier, and Dessa still had not accepted the absence of her voice. At 72 years old, Dessa had lived through difficult moments. She had faced losses, disappointments, and seasons that tested everything she believed about herself. But nothing compared to the emptiness that had followed Theda's departure. Throughout her entire life, Theda had been the one person who never left. When Dessa had problems, Theda listened without judgment. When something went well, Theda was the first to celebrate. And when everyone else seemed to pull away, when phone calls stopped and invitations grew rare, and the world shrank to the size of a quiet room, Theda remained. She was the constant. She was the center. That morning, as Dessa prepared to attend the reading of the will, she was not thinking about money. She was not thinking about property or investments or bank accounts. The only thing she wanted was for her mother's wishes to be respected, whatever those wishes turned out to be. Before leaving, she picked up a framed photograph from the table beside her bed. It was an old image, slightly faded at the edges, showing Dessa and Theda smiling together in front of the old family house in rural East Tennessee. The house looked strong in that photograph, the paint bright, the porch lined with flower pots Theda tended every summer. Dessa held the picture for several seconds and felt a familiar tightness in her throat. Then she breathed deeply, placed the photograph carefully inside her handbag, and walked out the door. The notary's office was located in a quiet part of the city, a single-story building with tall windows and dark wooden furniture visible through the glass. When Dessa arrived, she immediately saw her two older sisters sitting in the waiting room. Sable, the eldest, at 75, wore an expensive silk blouse and several gold bracelets that clinked softly every time she moved her hands. Her posture was upright, almost rigid, as though she had already decided how this day would end and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Blythe, 74, sat beside her, holding a cell phone, scrolling through messages with a relaxed expression that seemed entirely disconnected from the occasion. Neither of them appeared particularly affected by the recent death of their mother. Dessa approached slowly and greeted them. Sable lifted her gaze and responded with a brief smile that looked more like an obligation than a sign of warmth. Blythe barely murmured a hello before turning back to the screen. The atmosphere was uncomfortable, but it was also familiar. The relationship between the three sisters had not been close for many years. The differences had existed since they were young. Sable always wanted to stand above everyone else, to be noticed, to be admired, to be in control. Blythe had developed the habit of following Sable in almost every decision, not out of agreement, but out of convenience, because standing beside the strongest person in the room felt safer than standing alone. Dessa, on the other hand, had lived a quieter life. She worked modest jobs, kept a small circle of friends, and spent more time with Theda than either of her sisters ever did. She never competed with them. She never asked for more than what she had, and perhaps because of that, they had learned to overlook her. Theda had tried for years to keep the family together. She organized reunions, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations. She called each daughter every week without fail. She sent cards, baked pies, showed up at hospital rooms and school events, in front porches with a casserole in her hands and a smile on her face. But the tension between the sisters never fully disappeared. It sat beneath every conversation like a root growing under a sidewalk, invisible until the day the concrete finally cracks. An assistant opened the door and announced that they could enter. The three sisters walked into a large room where the notary was already waiting. On a wide wooden desk sat several perfectly organized folders. The man greeted them with courtesy and asked them to take their seats. Dessa settled into a chair and observed the documents in front of her. She felt a mixture of sadness and nerves. The notary began by explaining several legal details related to the succession. He confirmed that the will was valid and that all provisions had been properly registered. Sable shifted impatiently. Blythe crossed her arms and watched the notary with sharp attention. Finally, the moment arrived. The man opened a folder and began reading. First came several smaller bequests directed to nephews, neighbors, and individuals who had helped Theta during her final years. Dessa smiled when she heard those names. It was entirely like her mother to remember the people who had shown her kindness. Then the main assignments began. The notary announced that Sable would inherit a significant sum of money along with several financial investments. Sable's smile appeared instantly wide and uncontainable. Blythe received a collection of family jewelry, multiple savings accounts, and several agricultural properties that had belonged to the family for decades. Blythe exchanged a satisfied look with her sister. Dessa listened in silence. She assumed her portion was coming next, perhaps a share of the land or a jointly owned property. Then the notary continued. According to the document, the only property assigned directly to Dessa was the old family house located in a small rural community several hours away. Nothing else. No investments, no significant bank accounts, no valuable land, only that old house that had not been permanently inhabited in years. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. Dessa blinked several times trying to process what she had just heard. The notary reviewed the document again. There was no error. The distribution was written exactly that way by the will of Theta Kincaid. Every word had been chosen, every allocation deliberate. Theta had signed and dated the document in the presence of witnesses. There was no room for ambiguity and no basis for appeal. Sable was the first to break the silence. She tried to hide her smile but failed. Blythe did not bother trying. Dessa remained still. What she felt was not anger. It was confusion so deep it felt like waking up in a room she had never seen before. She knew her mother better than anyone. Theta had always been fair. That was the one thing Dessa had never questioned. And now for the first time she could not understand. When the meeting ended, the three sisters walked out of the office. The moment they crossed the door, Sable let out a small laugh. Blythe joined in. Neither made the slightest effort to conceal their satisfaction. Sable said she now had enough resources to pursue several personal projects she had been planning for years. Blythe talked about selling some of the land for immediate profit. Then they turned the conversation toward the old house. They said it was barely worth anything. They estimated that maintaining it would probably cost more than any benefit it could ever produce. They wondered aloud why Theta had chosen to leave that particular property to Dessa. Then Sable said something that cut deeper than any legal document ever could. Maybe Mom thought you wouldn't know what to do with real money, so she gave you the house to play with. Blythe laughed, but the laugh died quickly. For one brief instant, her eyes met Dessa's, and something flickered across her face. It might have been guilt. It might have been regret. Whatever it was, it vanished before it could take shape, and Blythe turned away to follow Sable toward the parking lot. Dessa stood alone on the sidewalk. The words hurt not because they were cruel, but because they touched a fear she had carried quietly for a long time. The fear that perhaps after everything her mother really did think she was not enough. During the drive home, Dessa thought constantly about Theta. The more she reflected, the less sense the situation made. Theta never made decisions randomly. If she had left that house specifically to Dessa, there had to be a reason. Perhaps the property held a meaning the others could not see. That idea began to grow in her mind. When she arrived at her apartment, she took out the photograph again and studied it closely. The image showed the front of the old house, the porch, the yard, the trees behind it. She remembered the summers of her childhood. She remembered her grandfather, Nolan, working the land. She remembered Theta cooking while the whole family gathered around the table. That house had been the setting for some of the happiest moments of her life. That night, while Sable and Blythe celebrated their new fortune, somewhere across the city, Dessa made a decision that would surprise everyone. She would not sell the property. She would not try to exchange it for money. She would not let it continue falling apart in silence. She was going to move there. The decision came to her not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet settling, the way a compass needle finally stops trembling and points north. She had spent the entire evening sitting in her apartment, surrounded by the small, practical evidence of a life lived modestly. a second-hand bookshelf filled with novels she had read more than once, a kitchen table with two chairs, one of which no one had sat in for years, photographs on the mantle, most of them featuring Theta. This apartment had served her well, but it had never felt like a place she belonged to. It felt like a place she stayed because she had nowhere else to go. Now she did. 2 weeks later, Dessa finished loading the last boxes into a moving truck. She did not own many possessions. Over the years, she had learned to live with what was necessary. As she watched the workers close the back door of the vehicle, she felt a mixture of nerves and something she had not expected: excitement. Many people would have considered it foolish to leave the comfort of the city for a deteriorating old house in a rural community miles from anywhere. But for Dessa, the decision made sense in a way she could not fully explain. Since Theta's death, something inside her kept saying she needed to return to that place. She did not know exactly what she was looking for. Perhaps peace, perhaps answers, perhaps simply the feeling of being near her mother one more time. The drive took several hours. As the highway unfolded, the landscape changed gradually. Buildings disappeared, replaced by open fields, ancient trees, and narrow country roads. The further she traveled from the city, the more she felt the noise of the last few weeks fading behind her. The arguments, the paperwork, the looks on her sisters' faces when they realized she was not going to sell. All of it grew quieter with every mile. Dessa watched through the window as memories arrived one after another. She remembered traveling with her parents during summer vacations, all five of them packed into a station wagon with the windows down. She remembered the laughter, the family meals that stretched past sunset, the afternoons running through the land surrounding the property while Nolan called after them to stay where he could see. She remembered the way Theta always fell asleep during the last hour of the drive home, her head tilted against the passenger window, and how Dessa would watch her from the back seat and think she had never seen anyone look so peaceful. Those memories had not visited her in years. Now they returned with a clarity that surprised her, as though the land itself was pulling them out of storage. When the old house finally appeared in the distance, her heart beat faster. The structure was still standing, but the years had left their marks. Paint peeled from the exterior walls in long, curling strips that hung like old skin. Several windows were clouded with dust, so thick the glass looked frosted. The garden was overgrown with weeds and dry branches, and a section of the fence along the property line had collapsed under the weight of a fallen limb that no one had come to clear. The roof showed visible signs of wear, with several shingles missing, and a dark stain near the chimney that suggested a leak had been working its way through for more than one winter. Yet despite all of that, Dessa felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt home. Not the polished, comfortable version of home that exists in magazines or on television. Something raw, something that lived in the bones of the place and reached out to meet her the way an old friend reaches out a hand at a funeral. This house knew her, and she knew it. The truck stopped in front of the main entrance. Dessa stepped out slowly and stood for several seconds observing the facade. The wind moved dry leaves gently across the yard. "I came back, Mom," she whispered. No one answered, of course, but the words gave her peace. When she opened the front door, a cloud of dust rose into the air. The smell of old wood filled her lungs. Everything seemed frozen in time. Furniture stood in the same places she remembered. Some chairs were draped with old sheets. Paintings hung on the walls. The old dining room cabinet still held pieces of the dishes Theta had used for years. Dessa moved through each room slowly until she reached the bedroom that had belonged to Theta as a child. On a dusty dresser, she found an old framed family photograph. In the image stood Theta, her parents, and the three sisters when they were small. Sable was smiling. Blythe held a doll. Dessa sat beside Theta, leaning into her. The photograph triggered a memory. Theta had once told her many years ago that some people spend their entire lives chasing things that can be lost in an instant, while others learn to value what remains. Dessa had not understood those words at the time. Now they returned to her mind with a weight that was almost physical. The following day, while Dessa was sweeping the front porch, a woman appeared walking up the dirt road carrying a box of baked goods. She was around 68 with a weathered face and kind eyes. "You must be Dessa. I'm Marin Pruitt. I run the general store about 4 miles east. Your mother and I were friends for a long time." Dessa invited her onto the porch. They talked for nearly an hour. Marin shared memories of Theta's small stories about her visits to the community, the way she always brought extra food for neighbors who were struggling. Then Marin said something that caught Dessa completely off guard. Your mama came back to this house more often than most people know, especially those last few years. She'd stay for a few days, then drive back to the city without telling anyone why. Dessa frowned. Theta had never mentioned those visits. I don't know what she was doing here exactly, Marin continued. She kept to herself mostly. But I'll tell you this, some nights I drive past and see the light on inside the old barn out back. Before Dessa could respond, Marin added another piece of information. About 3 months before Theta died, a man she did not recognize came into her store asking questions about the history of land ownership in the area, specifically about the Kincaid family. He was well-dressed, polite, spoke smoothly, but something about him made Marin uncomfortable. She could not remember his name, but she remembered his face clearly. Dessa stored that information carefully in her mind. She asked Marin if she had ever mentioned it to anyone else. Marin shook her head. She said she had been thinking about telling Dessa since the day she heard about the inheritance, but she wanted to meet her first. She wanted to see what kind of person Theta's youngest daughter had become. Now that she had, she was glad she came. Before leaving, Marin squeezed Dessa's hand and said something that felt less like a pleasantry and more like a warning wrapped in kindness. Your mama kept her reasons close. She always had reasons, though. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That evening, while organizing objects in the main sitting room, Dessa heard a dry sound from the corner. She turned her head. The noise seemed to come from an old wall clock that had belonged to her grandfather Nolan. It had been one of the most treasured pieces in the house for as long as Dessa could remember. She walked closer and examined the face. The hands pointed to exactly 6:20. She tried to move them. Nothing happened. She assumed the mechanism was simply broken and continued with her work. The next morning she checked again. The hand still read 6:20. She tried winding it. It did not respond. 3 days later, something changed. While cleaning another room, Dessa heard the sound of the clock ticking. She rushed to the sitting room and watched as the hands moved slowly for almost a full minute. Then they stopped. Exactly at 6:20. Dessa stared at the clock for a long time. She did not understand what was happening. That same afternoon, she began organizing a wall covered in old frame photographs. Among them was a portrait of Theta as a young woman around 20 years old. It seemed slightly tilted. When Dessa tried to straighten it, she noticed something strange. The frame was secured to the wall far more firmly than any of the others, as though someone had deliberately fastened it to prevent anyone from removing it. Curiosity took hold. After several attempts, she managed to pull it off the wall. Behind the portrait, the surface appeared normal at first glance. But when she looked more carefully, she noticed faint marks around a rectangular section, as though at some point an opening had existed there and been sealed. Dessa ran her hand across the surface. She found no visible mechanism, but the feeling that something was hidden refused to go away. That night, Dessa sat in the main room drinking coffee when the clock started ticking again. The hands moved for a few seconds and stopped at 6:20, but this time she heard something else, a faint click coming from somewhere in the room. She stood immediately and searched around the clock, the walls, the floor. Nothing obvious. But that sound suggested the clock and the wall might be connected. For the next hour, she examined every inch of the sitting room. Finally, on the bottom edge of the clock's wooden case, hidden beneath decades of dust, she found a small inscription carved into the wood. 2 words. Look behind. A chill passed through her body. She turned slowly toward the wall where Theta's portrait had been hanging. For the first time, Dessa began to suspect that the clock, the painting, and this house were all part of a chain of clues that someone had carefully prepared. Theta had not left that inscription by accident. She had been guiding Dessa towards something that had remained hidden for a very long time. The next morning, Dessa searched the study that had once belonged to Nolan. She pulled books, boxes, and documents from every shelf. Inside a lower cabinet, she found an ancient Bible covered in a thick layer of dust. She recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Theta for many years. What was strange was that she had never seen it stored in this particular location before. Dessa carried it to the window, sat down in the morning light, and opened it slowly. The spine cracked softly as though the book itself was exhaling after years of being closed. Yellowed papers appeared between the pages, pressed flat by time and weight. Receipts, prayer cards, a faded ribbon that might once have been read. Then something fell to the floor. A folded envelope clearly hidden there a long time ago, placed between the pages of Psalms with a precision that could not have been accidental. Dessa picked it up and recognized the handwriting at once. It was her mother's. The letters were slightly unsteady, as though Theta had written the name on the envelope during a moment of strong emotion, or perhaps during a time when her hands were no longer as sure as they once had been. She sat for several seconds without moving. The simple act of seeing Theta's handwriting made her hands tremble. The afternoon light entered softly through the glass, while the silence of the old house surrounded her completely. She breathed deeply before opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper yellowed by time, but perfectly legible. The first line spoke of family memories, of moments lived in this house, of the importance of never forgetting where you came from. Then came a sentence that made her heart beat harder. The real treasure of our family was never in the bank or in the land. It lives where love has always lived. Dessa read those words twice, then a third time. Theta never wrote vaguely without a reason. The letter continued speaking of secrets kept for generations, of decisions made to protect the family, of truths that one day needed to see the light. But it did not explain directly what any of it meant. It was as though Theta wanted to leave clues without revealing the full answer. At the end of the letter appeared one final line. When you find what others stop seeing, you will understand why this house came to your hands. 2 days after finding the letter, a county sheriff's vehicle pulled up in front of the house. Deputy Corinne Breyer stepped out. She was around 45, with a strong build, short brown hair, and an expression that suggested she was accustomed to asking questions that people did not want to answer. Corinne explained that someone in the community had reported unusual activity at the property. Lights on late at night, furniture being moved, sounds at odd hours. She asked Dessa directly whether she was searching for something and whether the house was connected to any legal issues. Dessa explained calmly that she was simply cleaning the house she had inherited from her mother. Corinne listened without interrupting, but did not look fully convinced. She walked a few steps to the side and looked past Dessa into the house, her eyes moving across the room with the trained awareness of someone who notices when a piece of furniture has been recently moved or a layer of dust has been disturbed. She did not ask to enter, but the look made clear she could. "This is a quiet area, Mrs. Kincaid," Corinne said before leaving. "People notice everything around here. If something happens, I will know about it." The visit left Dessa unsettled. She understood now that every move she made was being observed by the community around her, and that she could not search for clues too openly without drawing more attention. She also understood something else. If the deputy had arrived this quickly, based on a single complaint from a neighbor, then anyone watching the property with serious intent would know exactly where Dessa was and what she was doing at almost every hour of the day. Despite the pressure, Dessa returned to the sitting room the following morning. She remembered something Nolan used to say when she was a child. He always told her that the best hiding places were not found by staring at the hidden object, but by looking at what surrounded it. That idea changed her approach entirely. Instead of focusing on the rectangular marks on the wall, she began examining everything around them. The door frames, the wooden molding, the decorative trim. It was there, just a few inches from where the portrait had hung, that she found it. A tiny piece of metal embedded in the decorative woodwork. It was so small and so deliberately placed that anyone could have passed it 1,000 times without ever noticing. Dessa pressed it carefully. Nothing happened. She pressed again, harder. This time she heard a click inside the wall. Her heart began to race. She stepped back. Slowly, a rectangular section of the wall began to separate from the surface opening just a few inches. Dessa watched with disbelief as a hidden compartment appeared. For several seconds, she could not move. Then she stepped forward and opened it completely. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry, no legal documents. What she found were several old envelopes, a small notebook, and a carefully sealed wooden box. The envelopes contained family photographs, some showing Theta as a young woman, others showing Nolan working in different parts of the property. Many had notes written on the back with dates, names, and simple observations that seemed to point to specific locations on the land. The notebook was filled with entries written by Theta. She described frequent visits to the property during her final years, recording dates, observations, and references to conversations with people in the community. One phrase stopped Dessa cold. Dad was right. The answers are still here. She was referring to Nolan. But what answers, what secret had her grandfather left behind? Dessa opened the wooden box. Inside were several old keys and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map showing part of the house and several nearby structures. One of them was circled in red. She recognized it immediately. It was the old barn located some distance from the main house, the same barn that had been closed for years after part of its structure was damaged in a storm. Below the drawing, Theta had written a note. Sometimes memory hides where no one thinks to look. While Dessa was still laying out the documents on the dining room table, she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching on the main road. She looked through the window. A dark car had just pulled up in front of the property. Two figures stepped out, Sable and Blythe. Neither looked like they were there for a friendly visit. Their movements were quick and tense. Their eyes scanned the property as though searching for something. Dessa opened the front door before they reached the porch. Sable spoke first, attempting a smile that could not hide the anxiety underneath. Blythe stayed a few steps behind her, gaze moving carefully across the walls, the furniture, the tables. Dessa greeted them calmly and invited them inside. For the first several minutes, the conversation stayed on the surface. The weather, the drive, trivial family matters. But Dessa knew they had not driven several hours to talk about nothing. Then the real questions began. Sable asked which rooms Dessa had cleaned. She wanted to know which cabinets had been opened. She asked specifically whether Dessa had found any old documents. Blythe showed interest in certain objects that had belonged to Theta and Nolan. Dessa answered carefully, revealing nothing of what she had discovered. When Sable asked to walk through the house, Dessa agreed. The three of them moved through the rooms. Sable studied every wall and every piece of furniture with sharp attention. Blythe opened doors and examined shelves with an interest she tried to disguise. When they reached the sitting room, both of them glanced toward the spot where Theta's portrait had hung. It lasted only a second, but Dessa caught it. Before leaving, Sable made an unexpected suggestion. She said it might be wise to sell the property. She pointed out that maintaining such an old structure would become a financial burden. She even offered to help find buyers. She phrased it as concern, as sisterly advice, but the offer landed with the weight of something rehearsed. Dessa declined immediately. Sable tried to push the idea further, mentioning property taxes, insurance costs, the expense of heating an old house through a Tennessee winter. But she quickly understood she would not succeed. Dessa's refusal was not argumentative, it was simply complete. Minutes later, the two sisters left the property. But as the car disappeared down the road, Blythe stopped at the porch steps. She turned back and spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. "Be careful, Dessa." Dessa asked what she meant. Careful of what? Careful of whom? Blythe shook her head, said nothing more, and walked to the car. The engine started. The vehicle pulled away. Dust settled on the road, and Dessa stood alone on the porch of the old house, holding her mother's notebook against her chest, understanding for the first time that whatever Theta had hidden here, whatever truth waited inside these walls and beneath that old barn, it was something that other people already suspected, something they wanted badly enough to drive hours for, and something that Dessa was now the only person standing between them and it. Sable did not waste time. Within 48 hours of returning from the visit to the property, she had already made a phone call that would change the course of the entire story. The person she contacted was a man named Leland Holbrook. Leland was 52 years old, a lawyer who specialized in inheritance disputes, property conflicts, and family estate litigation. He had spent his career finding legal cracks in documents that other attorneys considered airtight. He was known for his ability to turn an ambiguous clause into a weapon and a grieving family into a client willing to pay any fee. Sable had heard of him through a friend years ago. She never imagined she would need his services. Now she could not dial the number fast enough. She and Blythe met him 2 days later in his office in downtown Knoxville. It was an elegant space with dark leather chairs and tall bookshelves filled with volumes no one ever read. A framed degree from Vanderbilt Law hung behind his desk, slightly crooked, as though it had been bumped many times and never straightened. Leland listened to everything they told him. He asked precise questions about the property, about Nolan Kincaid, about old land records and family history. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, writing in small, tight script that suggested a mind accustomed to compressing complicated ideas into manageable shapes. Sable and Blythe did not have answers to everything, but what they described was enough to spark something behind his eyes. He leaned back in his chair and tapped the pen against the pad, and for a moment he looked like a man who had just been told that the thing he had been searching for might actually exist. What neither of them knew was the conversation Leland had before they arrived. A phone call from a number he had learned to dread. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and unmistakably threatening. It reminded him that his outstanding gambling debts had exceeded the deadline. It informed him that after the end of the month, the conversations would no longer happen over the phone. Leland placed the receiver down and pressed his palms flat against his desk until his hands stopped shaking. He straightened his tie, put on the smile he wore like armor, and opened the door to welcome Sable and Blythe into his office. He was not interested in their case because it was just. He was interested because he was desperate. Within days, Leland called Dessa. He introduced himself with the kind of warmth that sounded rehearsed. He explained that he represented certain interests related to the family estate and requested a meeting to discuss the property. Something in his voice made Dessa uncomfortable, but she agreed to listen. He arrived at the house that same week. A well-dressed man in his early 50s with polished shoes and a handshake that lasted a second too long. During the first several minutes, he complimented the property and mentioned a few historical details about the region. Then he shifted. He suggested Dessa consider selling the house. He said there were interested buyers and that this could be an excellent opportunity to turn an aging structure into real money. Dessa told him she had no intention of selling. Leland smiled the way someone smiles when they have 3 more strategies prepared behind the first one. He began talking about maintenance costs that would multiply each year. He mentioned possible legal complications with rural property boundaries. He even implied that certain sections of the land might have documentation irregularities that could require long and expensive processes to resolve. Dessa said nothing. She let him talk. And the more he talked, the more obvious it became that this was not advice. It was pressure. She noticed the way his eyes moved around the room while he spoke, not looking at her, but cataloging the space, scanning the walls, the shelves, the places where old documents might be stored. He was not just a lawyer selling a service. He was a man taking inventory of something he intended to acquire. Before leaving, Leland paused at the door and delivered one final sentence. I would advise you to be cautious before making any decisions related to anything you might discover on this property. He was gone before Dessa could respond. But those words confirmed something critical. Leland knew she was searching, and he almost certainly knew more than he was telling. The following morning, Dessa walked a quarter-mile down a narrow trail behind the barn to find the house where Alton Griggs lived. Alton was around 70, a quiet man who had been a neighbor of the Kincaid family for decades. According to some of Theta's notes, he had helped her inspect and maintain the barn structure several years earlier. Dessa needed someone who understood old buildings well enough to tell her whether the barn was safe to enter and examine. She knocked on his door. Alton opened it halfway. His expression was not hostile, but it was not welcoming either. Dessa introduced herself and explained what she needed. He cut her off before she finished. I don't want anything to do with the Kincaid family business. Your mother asked me to keep quiet, and I kept quiet. You should leave things alone. Dessa asked what Theta had asked him to keep quiet about. Alton stared at her for a long moment. His jaw tightened. Then he stepped back and closed the door without answering. She stood on his porch, listening to the silence that followed. Through the curtained window, she could see his shadow move away from the door and disappear into the interior of the house. The rejection stung not because it was personal, but because it confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. Theta had involved people in whatever she was doing at this property. She had asked them for silence. And whatever was hidden here was significant enough that even a neighbor who owed nothing to anyone was afraid of being connected to it. Dessa walked back down the trail, slowly thinking about the way Alton had looked at her when she mentioned Theta's name. There had been recognition in his eyes, and behind it something that looked very much like guilt. Dessa drove 4 miles east to find Colton Yancey. He lived in a small white house at the end of a gravel road surrounded by oak trees so old their branches nearly touched the ground. Colton was 86, thin and slow, but his eyes still carried the sharp attention of a man who had spent his whole life observing more than he spoke about. He sat beneath the shade of the largest oak, and when Dessa stepped out of her truck, he studied her face for several seconds before a faint smile appeared. They talked for a long time, about Theta, about Nolan, about the years when the Kincaid property was the center of family life in this part of Tennessee. Colton spoke carefully, choosing his words the way a man handles old china. Then Dessa showed him some of the photographs from the hidden compartment. Colton's expression changed completely. The gentle nostalgia vanished. He held the photographs close to his face, turning them slowly, examining each detail. "Your mother found more than I ever expected," he said quietly. Dessa asked him to explain. Colton was silent for nearly a full minute before responding. He told her that Nolan had spent much of his life protecting certain information connected to the family. He said that people had attempted to uncover that information decades ago. Investors, outsiders, people whose motives were never fully clear. That was why Nolan developed a system of hiding places and clues, spreading the evidence across multiple locations, so no single discovery would reveal the full truth. Colton would not give details. Every time Dessa pressed further, he redirected the conversation. But before she left, he reached into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a small photograph he had kept for many years. In it stood Nolan Theta and several men in front of the old barn. On the back, someone had written a single sentence. "Everything started here." Colton also offered a warning. He told Dessa to be careful around Leland Holbrook. According to Colton, the lawyer had been asking questions about old properties in the region long before Theta died. He had shown particular interest in certain histories connected to the Kincaid name. Colton said he first noticed it about 5 years ago when a man fitting Leland's description appeared at a county records office requesting archived surveys of land parcels in the eastern part of the county. At the time, no one thought much of it. Lawyers filed requests like that every day. But Colton remembered because the specific parcels included the Kincaid property and because the request was made long before there was any public reason for a lawyer to care about that piece of land. Dessa drove back to the property with a growing certainty that the barn was at the center of everything. She spent the rest of that day and the next morning searching rooms she had not yet fully explored. Closets, drawers, shelves that had not been opened in decades. Most of what she found was unremarkable. Then near midday on the second day, she climbed to the attic. It was a space she had barely touched since arriving. The air was thick with dust. Old boxes, furniture draped in cloth, and objects accumulated across generations filled every corner. Dessa moved slowly with a flashlight, opening boxes one at a time. She found old toys, faded clothing, family albums, tools that had belonged to Nolan. After more than an hour of searching with nothing to show for it, she was ready to climb back down. Then she noticed a wooden trunk pushed behind a stack of broken chairs and old picture frames. The padlock was rusted but not fully secured. She pried it open. Inside were folders, deteriorating documents in a small metal box. When she opened the box, her breath stopped. A notebook, old dark, covered with corners worn soft by time. On the first page, written in faded ink, was a name: Nolan Kincaid. Dessa ran her thumb across the letters. She had not seen her grandfather's handwriting in decades, and the sight of it brought back a rush of images she had not expected. Nolan at his desk in the study, glasses low on his nose, writing while the radio played in the background. Nolan folding a letter into an envelope and placing it in his shirt pocket with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that some words once committed to paper could never be taken back. Dessa carried the notebook downstairs and began reading at the dining room table. The first pages were ordinary. Notes about farming activities, expenses, weather patterns, observations about the property. But gradually the content shifted. Nolan began writing about explorations he conducted at various points across the land. He mentioned visits from specialists. He referenced studies carried out in secret. He used a phrase again and again without ever defining it. The discovery. Dessa turned pages faster, her pulse climbing. Then she reached a section where the handwriting grew more urgent, the sentences shorter, the details more specific. Nolan described a meeting held decades ago with a group of experts. The results he wrote were extraordinary. He began to explain what had been found. And then the pages were gone, torn from the spine. Someone had removed precisely the section that mattered most. Dessa pressed her palms against the table and exhaled slowly. The frustration was immense, but she was not going to stop. She went through the remaining pages carefully. Despite the gaps, there were still useful entries. Several referenced specific locations on the property. Others mentioned documents hidden in separate places. And near the very end of the notebook, one line stood apart from the rest, written in deliberate, careful letters. If this ever comes to light, look where the barn shadow begins at dawn. That evening, Dessa drove to Marin's store to buy supplies. The bell above the door rang as she entered, and Marin looked up from behind the counter with an expression that Dessa had not seen on her face before. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for a specific person to walk through that door. Marin pulled her aside before she reached the register. The older woman spoke in a low voice, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to walk through it. "That man's been back," Marin said. "Not the lawyer, someone younger, about 40. Short hair, glasses, drives a gray pickup truck. He's been in here twice this week asking questions about you. Wants to know what you do all day, whether you have visitors, whether you've been spending time at the barn." He tried to make it sound casual, like he was just making conversation. "But I've been running this store for 30 years, Desa. I know the difference between someone making conversation and someone collecting information." Dessa felt something cold settle in her chest. She asked if Marin knew who he was. Marin did not, but she was certain he was not from the area. She said the man paid in cash both times and never gave his name. Dessa thanked her and drove home as the sun was setting. She parked in front of the house and sat in the truck for a moment, watching the property in the failing light. Then she saw it, a beam of light moving inside the barn. Someone was in there. She killed the engine and stayed still. Through the barn's warped boards, she could see the flashlight sweeping across the interior, pausing, moving again. Whoever it was searched methodically, checking the walls, the floor, the corners. Dessa watched for more than 10 minutes, barely breathing, until the light went out. A figure emerged from the barn's side door and walked quickly to a vehicle parked on the dirt path behind the tree line. A gray pickup truck. The engine started. The headlights flicked on. The truck pulled away down the back road and vanished. Dessa ran to the barn. The padlock on the main door had been pried open. The metal was bent outward where a tool had been forced through the shackle. Inside, several old crates had been overturned and pushed aside. Tools that had been hanging on wall hooks were now scattered across the floor. Whoever had been there was looking for something specific and had not been gentle about it. They had not found it because Dessa had not yet discovered the entrance to whatever lay beneath the barn's floor. But they knew to look here, and they would come back. The certainty of that thought sat in Dessa's stomach like a weight she could not set down. She replaced the padlock with a heavier one from the house, knowing it would not stop anyone truly determined. Then she went back inside and locked every door and checked every window before sitting down at the kitchen table, where Theta's notes and the map with the circled barn waited in the lamplight. The next morning, Dessa reported the break-in to Corinne Breyer. Corinne arrived within the hour in her county vehicle, the gravel crunching under the tires as she parked beside the barn. She inspected the damaged padlock, took photographs from 3 angles, and made detailed notes on the condition of the interior. She examined the tool marks on the metal and the boot prints in the soft earth near the side door. Then she turned to Dessa with an expression that was harder than the one she had worn during her first visit. "Mrs. Kincaid, this is the second time I've come to your property in 2 weeks. Someone broke into your barn. Before that, people reported unusual activity. I need you to be straight with me. What is inside this house or this barn that someone wants badly enough to break in for?" Dessa hesitated. She weighed the risk of saying too much against the risk of saying too little. She studied Corinne's face, looking for any sign that the deputy's interest was personal rather than professional. She found none. Corinne was doing her job. She chose a middle path. "My mother left behind some family documents, important ones. I believe someone is trying to take them." Corinne studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, wrote something in her notebook, and said she would look into the gray pickup truck. She did not promise anything, but Dessa could see the shift happening behind Corinne's eyes. The deputy was no longer suspicious of Dessa. She was becoming suspicious of whoever was circling her. That night, Leland Holbrook called. His voice had changed. The polished warmth from his visit was gone, replaced by something flat and direct. He said he had heard about the incident at the property and repeated that selling the house would resolve everything. He offered a specific dollar amount. It was more than Dessa had expected. For the first time, he sounded less like a lawyer making a suggestion and more like a man running out of time. And for the first time, Dessa did not say no immediately. "Let me think about it," she said. She hung up the phone and sat alone in the kitchen. The house was dark except for the light above the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Dessa felt the weight of every week she had spent in this house pressing down on her shoulders. She had been followed. Her property had been broken into. A lawyer she did not trust was circling. Her sisters had turned the inheritance into a weapon. The community watched her every move, and she was alone, completely and entirely alone. She looked at the photograph of Theta she kept on the kitchen counter. For the first time since arriving, she spoke to it not with hope, but with exhaustion. Mom, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. She sat with that feeling for a long time. The clock in the other room was silent. The house creaked softly in the wind. Dessa closed her eyes and thought about packing. She thought about driving back to the city. She thought about handing Leland Holbrook the keys and walking away from all of it. She imagined Sable's satisfaction. She imagined the relief of no longer looking over her shoulder every time she heard a car on the road. She imagined a quiet apartment where nobody broke in, nobody watched, nobody cared what she did or did not find. For the first time since arriving, surrender felt not only possible but rational. She was 72 years old alone in a house that was falling apart around her, fighting people who had more money, more connections, and more willingness to break rules than she could ever match. She opened her eyes and looked around the kitchen, the counter where Theta used to roll pie dough, the window where morning light fell on the spot Theta always chose for her coffee, the hook on the wall where Theta hung her apron still holding its shape after all these years. "What would you do, Mom?" Dessa asked the empty room. The empty room did not answer, but the question itself clarified something she had not been able to see through the fog of exhaustion and fear. Theta had faced worse. Theta had carried this secret for decades alone, against people who wanted to take it, and she had never once given up. Then the next morning, she opened the metal box she had dug up near the barn the day before. She had followed the barn shadow at dawn, found the marker Nolan had left decades ago, and unearthed a rusted container filled with waterproof documents, maps, and technical reports. She had read some of them already, but in her exhaustion the night before she had not gone through everything. Now sorting through the remaining papers, she found a small, folded note tucked between two maps. The paper was different from the others, softer, more personal. She unfolded it and recognized Theta's handwriting. "My girl, if you are writing this, it means you are exactly where you need to be. Do not stop. I trust you more than anyone in this world." Dessa read the note 3 times. Then she folded it, placed it on the table, and sat still for what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes. Something shifted inside her, not dramatically, not like a wall collapsing or a switch being thrown, more like a bone settling back into its socket after months out of place. She stood up, washed her face, put on her jacket, and walked directly to the barn. Not because the fear was gone, it was not, but because she had decided that being afraid would no longer be the thing that stopped her. At the barn, she spread Nolan's hand-drawn maps across a workbench and began comparing them with the actual dimensions of the structure. She measured the exterior walls with a tape she had brought from the house, then paced out the interior space. The numbers did not match. The outside was larger than the inside by several feet. Somewhere within these walls or beneath this floor space had been concealed. She examined the floorboards section by section, crawling on her hands and knees, pressing and tapping. Near the far corner, she found a group of planks that were subtly different from the rest. The grain of the wood was finer. The nails were a different type. The wear pattern did not match the surrounding boards. Dessa found a metal pry bar among the old tools and wedged it beneath the edge of the first plank. Nothing moved. She shifted position, applied pressure from a different angle, and heard a small sound beneath the wood. She kept working, sweat forming on her forehead, despite the cool air, until one section of the floor lifted just enough for her to get her fingers underneath. She pulled. The plank came free, then another, then a third. Below the floorboards was darkness. Dessa shone her flashlight into the opening but could not see the bottom. The air that rose from the gap was old and still carrying the scent of earth and sealed time. It smelled the way a room smells when it has been holding its breath for 40 years. Dessa sat back on her heels for a moment. Her arms ached from prying the boards. Her knees were sore from kneeling on the rough wood. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She had been searching for weeks, following a trail of clues that her mother and grandfather had built across decades, and now she was staring into a hole in the ground that might contain the answer to all of it. Or it might contain nothing but old dirt and disappointment. There was only one way to find out. Before descending, Dessa stood and looked through the barn's open doorway. About 50 yards down the dirt road, Dalton Griggs was standing at the edge of his property watching her. Their eyes met across the distance. Neither spoke. Alton did not come closer, but he did not turn away either. After a long moment, he gave the smallest nod Dessa had ever seen, so slight it might have been imagined. Then he turned and walked back toward his house. Dessa turned back to the opening. A wooden ladder descended into the dark. The rungs were old, but appeared solid. She tested the first one with her weight, then the second. Each step produced a soft creak that echoed in the underground space. When she reached the bottom, she raised the flashlight, and the breath left her lungs. A room, built deliberately beneath the barn, not large, perhaps 12 feet by 15, but constructed with clear intention to preserve its contents for a very long time. The walls were reinforced with stone and timber. Heavy beams ran across the ceiling, supporting the barn floor above. Shelves lined both sides, holding metal boxes, filing cabinets, and simple furniture, all covered in a thick layer of dust that had been undisturbed for what might have been decades. In one corner stood a small wooden desk with a kerosene lamp on top of it, the glass chimney still intact as though someone had sat there many years ago reading by its light, and then stood up and walked away and never returned. Dessa moved to the nearest shelf and began opening folders. They were organized carefully, many labeled with dates, others with names she did not recognize. The documents inside described geological surveys conducted across different sections of the property. Technical reports with detailed maps and analyses prepared by specialists revealed years of exploratory drilling, sample collection, and laboratory results. Everything pointed towards something of significant value buried deep in the earth beneath the Kincaid land. At the back of the room stood a large metal box. The lock was open. Inside, protected by waterproof sleeves, lay a stack of documents more recent than anything else in the room. The top document bore the name and seal of a geological engineering firm. It contained signatures, official stamps, and detailed findings. The report confirmed the existence of a major gold deposit beneath a considerable portion of the inherited property. The concentrations were described as extraordinarily high. The economic estimates were numbers Dessa had to read 3 times because her mind refused to accept them the first 2. She set the report down on a dusty table and sat on an old wooden chair. Everything began to fall into place. Theda's secret visits, the hidden clues, the documents Nolan had protected, the reason neither of them had ever wanted to sell certain parts of the land. In another filing cabinet, she found letters exchanged between Nolan and various attorneys decades earlier, revealing that when the deposit was originally discovered, complex legal disputes existed over mineral extraction rights in the region. Powerful individuals had attempted to seize the findings. Nolan understood that making the information public would endanger his family, so he chose to protect everything in silence. He died before finding a legal path forward. Theda inherited the burden. On the bottom shelf, Dessa found a folder unlike any of the others. On its cover in Theda's handwriting was a name, Dessa Kincaid. Inside were several pages and a sealed letter. She recognized her mother's script. Her hands began to tremble. She held the letter for a moment without opening it. She was not ready. Not yet. It was during those final minutes underground that she heard sounds above her. Footsteps on the barn floor. Slow, deliberate moving across the boards she had pried open. Someone had entered the barn while she was below. Dessa switched off the flashlight and pressed herself against the cold wall. In the total darkness, she could hear each footstep clearly. The person walked to the area where the floor was open, paused, then continued moving around the interior of the barn. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 4 or 5 minutes, the footsteps retreated. She heard the barn door close, then silence. She waited 10 minutes before climbing back up. The barn was empty. Through a gap in the wallboards, she could see a vehicle pulling away down the back road. The shape of the truck was familiar. She covered the floor opening, carefully placing the planks back as close to their original position as she could manage. Then she gathered the most critical documents and carried them back to the house. She locked every door and window, stored the originals in a secure location, and made digital copies using the old scanner Marin had lent her from the store. It was past midnight when she finished. Dessa sat at the dining room table, the sealed letter with her name resting in front of her. She knew what was in the room beneath the barn. She knew what the land was worth. She understood why Nolan had hidden everything and why Theda had spent her final years making sure the truth would survive her. But the letter was different from all of that. Whatever Theda had written was meant for her alone, and it would explain not just what had been hidden, but why Theta had chosen her out of three daughters to be the one to find it. She was not going to open it tonight. She needed rest, and she needed to be fully present when she read whatever her mother had waited years to say. But as she rose from the table, she heard the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the front windows. Dessa moved quickly to the glass and looked out. A black sedan had stopped in front of the house. Three figures stepped out into the cold night air. Sable, Blythe, and a man in a dark overcoat whose face Dessa recognized from his visit days earlier. Leland Holbrook. The three of them walked side by side toward the front porch. Sable looked furious and focused. Leland carried a leather briefcase and wore the expression of a man who had come to collect something he believed was already his. And Blythe walked slightly apart from the other two, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her eyes fixed on the ground as though she was trying not to see where her own feet were taking her. Dessa tucked Theta's letter into a kitchen drawer, closed it, and turned toward the front door. She understood with absolute clarity that whatever protection Theta had built into this house, whatever truth waited inside that envelope, she was going to need all of it. Because the people walking toward her had not come to talk. They had come to take. Dessa did not wait for them to knock. She opened the front door and stood in the frame with the porch light behind her, watching Sable Blythe and Leland Holbrook approach in the cold night air. She had spent weeks searching this house alone, following clues left by a mother who trusted her with the most important secret the family had ever held. She had been followed, broken into, pressured, and nearly broken. She was not going to meet whatever came next sitting down. Sable spoke first. Her voice was clipped, direct, stripped of any pretense of warmth. She said they needed to talk immediately about the property and about everything that had been discovered in recent weeks. Blythe remained silent, her arms still wrapped around herself, her gaze moving between the floor and the dark trees beyond the yard. Leland stood half a step behind the two sisters, holding his leather briefcase against his chest, wearing an expression of professional calm that did not quite reach his eyes. Dessa invited them inside. She would not have this conversation on the porch. They sat in the main room. For several seconds, no one spoke. The clock on the wall had not moved from 6:20. The house was utterly still around them. Leland broke the silence. He explained in his measured courtroom tone that they had reviewed multiple aspects of the inheritance and that there were grounds to consider a legal reassessment of the distribution Theta had made. According to him, the discovery of the gold deposit fundamentally altered the real value of the property Dessa had inherited, making the original division inequitable. Sable jumped in before he finished. She said that none of them knew about the gold when the will was read. She declared that the situation had been unfair from the start. Blythe added almost mechanically that all three sisters should benefit equally. Dessa listened without interrupting. When they finished, she responded quietly. She reminded them that the will had been drafted legally by Theta with full mental capacity. She reminded them that for years no one had shown the slightest interest in this house. They were the ones who had called it worthless. They were the ones who had laughed. Sable's face tightened. "We are talking about millions of dollars, Dessa, not some broken-down cabin in the woods." The argument lasted nearly an hour. Neither side moved. Finally, Leland announced that they would be filing legal action to claim a share of the property and any future benefits connected to the deposit. He said it as though reading from a prepared statement, and Dessa understood that the words had been drafted long before they arrived. The three of them left. Dessa stood in the doorway watching the black sedan reverse down the dirt road. When the taillights disappeared around the bend, she noticed something on the top porch step. A small envelope placed there so carefully it might have been invisible in the dark if Dessa had not been looking down. She picked it up and opened it inside the house. It contained a single printed page, a copy of an email exchange between Leland Holbrook and Sable dated several months before Theta's death. The messages discussed strategies for accessing Kincaid family land records and identifying potential vulnerabilities in property documentation. Dessa read it twice. Then she understood. Blythe had left it. She had carried it in her coat pocket and placed it on the step while Sable and Leland walked ahead. She had chosen a side without saying a word. The next morning, Dessa retrieved the sealed letter from the kitchen drawer and sat at the dining room table. The letter from the underground room, the one bearing her name in Theta's handwriting. She had postponed this moment for as long as she could. She had needed to understand the documents first, to absorb the magnitude of what the land contained to survive the confrontation with her sisters. But now there was nothing left to delay it. She made coffee. She sat down. She opened the envelope slowly. Theta began the letter not with gold, not with land, not with legal strategies. She began with Dessa as a child. She described moments Dessa had nearly forgotten. A rainy afternoon when 7-year-old Dessa stayed home from school to sit beside Theta during a fever reading aloud from a picture book, even though Theta could barely hear the words through the haze of illness. A phone call Dessa made every single Sunday evening for 11 years, without missing once, not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted her mother to hear a familiar voice before the week began. A Thanksgiving when Sable and Blythe arrived late and left early, and Dessa stayed until midnight washing dishes and listening to Theta talk about Nolan. Dessa's eyes blurred before she reached the second page. Theta had remembered everything. Every small act of kindness that Dessa assumed had gone unnoticed. Every quiet gesture that she believed had disappeared into the ordinary noise of daily life. Then the letter shifted. Theta confessed that she had known about the gold deposit for decades. She explained that Nolan had revealed the secret to her shortly before his death and asked her to protect it until the right person could be trusted to inherit it. Theta had spent years observing her 3 daughters. She was not searching for the most intelligent or the most ambitious. She was looking for the one who understood the value of things that could not be purchased. Theta explained that she had designed the inheritance precisely. She left money and jewelry and productive land to Sable and Blythe because she knew those things would satisfy them immediately. She knew neither of them would ever bother to explore an old house they considered worthless. But she also knew that Dessa would return. She knew Dessa would walk through those rooms and remember. She knew Dessa would notice the clock, the portrait, the details that everyone else had learned to ignore. And so Theta had built a trail of clues, each one leading to the next, designed specifically for the daughter she trusted to follow them. The letter continued. Theta revealed that she had been aware of Leland Holbrook long before her death. She described how the lawyer had attempted to access family land records through intermediaries years earlier. That was why she reinforced the hiding places and added additional layers to the system of clues. She did not want the secret falling into the wrong hands. Then Theta wrote about Sable and Blythe. She did not write with anger. She wrote with the precise, sorrowful clarity of a mother who had watched her children make choices she could not support. She noted specific instances where Sable had attempted to influence decisions related to family assets in ways Theta considered troubling. She recorded dates when certain documents had been accessed or moved without authorization. Near the end, Theta wrote that she had prepared additional evidence in case disputes arose after her death. Some of it was stored alongside the legal documents in the underground room. Other pieces had been entrusted to people she trusted, people who would know when the time was right to deliver them. The final paragraphs were not about documents or secrets. They were about being a mother. Theta told Dessa she was proud of her. She thanked her for years of companionship, care, and steady love. She wrote that she had never been worried about who would receive the most money. The only thing that ever concerned her was whether the right person would receive the chance to build something good with the family legacy. She was certain Dessa would know how to do that. The last line filled an entire page by itself. If you are reading this, it means you found the truth. Now it is your turn to decide what to do with it. Dessa placed the letter on the table and sat without moving for a very long time. She felt the loss of her mother more sharply than she had since the funeral. But alongside the grief was something new. A sense of understanding so complete it seemed to fill the room. Theta had not forgotten her. Theta had not given her the worst share. Theta had given her the most important thing the family possessed, and she had spent years making sure Dessa would be the one to find it. Within days, Dessa contacted Cleve Creel, a geological engineer whose name appeared in Theta's files. Cleve traveled to the property and spent an entire day reviewing the documents from the underground room. His conclusion confirmed everything. The findings were authentic, the deposit was extraordinarily valuable, and the legal obstacles that had trapped Nolan decades earlier no longer existed under current regulations. He told Dessa to protect the documentation and find an independent attorney immediately. The news did not stay contained. The community was small. People had noticed Cleve's visit, the activity around the barn, the strangers who kept appearing on the roads near the Kincaid property. Rumors spread. Some talked about old documents. Others mentioned buried treasure. No one knew the full truth, but curiosity moved through the county with a speed that surprised everyone. Leland Holbrook heard the rumors within a week. He met with Sable and Blythe and laid out what he had gathered. When he mentioned the possibility of a significant gold deposit beneath the inherited property, Sable's disbelief lasted only seconds before collapsing into something closer to desperation. Blythe said nothing. She stared at the table and remembered the day of the will reading. She remembered the laughter. She remembered telling Dessa the house was worthless. Sable demanded solutions. Leland promised legal strategy, but before any of that could take shape, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Corinne Breyer called Dessa on a Tuesday morning. The deputy's voice was different from every previous conversation. There was no suspicion in it, no professional distance. Corinne spoke with the focused energy of a law enforcement officer who had found something real. She had traced the gray pickup truck to a man named Harlan Voss, 40 years old, a private investigator and sometime associate of Leland Holbrook. Voss had a prior conviction for document fraud in another state. Corinne had confirmed that Voss had visited the community multiple times before and after the barn break-in. He had questioned residents, photographed the property from public roads, and entered the barn without permission. "Mrs. Kincaid," Corinne said, "if your sister's lawyer hired a man with a fraud conviction to break into your property, that is a criminal matter. I am reporting this to the county sheriff." For the first time since moving to the house, Dessa felt the ground shift beneath her in a direction she had not expected. She had an ally, not a neighbor offering sympathy, not a friend of her mother sharing old memories. An officer of the law who had looked at the facts and decided that Dessa was not the problem. The people around her were. That same week, Sable discovered that Blythe had left the email printout for Dessa. The confrontation happened by phone. Sable's voice was sharp enough to cut through the receiver. She called Blythe a traitor. She said that everything they had built together, every plan, every advantage, depended on staying united. Blythe listened to every word, and then for the first time in 74 years of following her older sister's lead, she pushed back. "I cannot keep pretending that what we are doing is right," Blythe said. "Theta knew everything. She prepared for all of this, and I am tired of acting like she didn't." "If you are not with me," Sable responded, "then you will end up with nothing." Blythe was silent for several seconds. Then she hung up. Dessa hired Garnet Surency, an independent attorney known for integrity and meticulous preparation. Garnet was a tall, quiet man in his mid-50s who wore the same brown corduroy jacket to every meeting and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who believed that the truth properly assembled did not need to be shouted. He reviewed every document Dessa had gathered, including the email Blythe had provided. He spread the papers across his conference table and studied them the way a cartographer studies a landscape, looking not just at individual features, but at the way they connected to form a larger picture. He spent days analyzing the material before reaching a conclusion that gave Dessa the confidence to stop running and start fighting. Garnet told her plainly that she had a strong case, but he also warned her that strong cases could still be lost if the other side had more resources and fewer scruples. She told him she understood. She also told him she was not going to stop. But the most unexpected support came from the person Dessa least expected. One afternoon, a knock came at the front door. Dessa opened it and found Alton Griggs standing on the porch, holding a large manila envelope in both hands. He looked older than he had the day he refused to help her. His shoulders were lower, his breathing heavier. But his eyes held something Dessa had not seen before. Resolve. "I owe your mother a promise," he said, "and I owe you an apology." He stepped inside when Dessa invited him. Standing in the kitchen, he told her what he had kept silent about for years. Theta had asked for his help inspecting the barn's structure long before Dessa ever arrived. During one of those inspections, Alton had accidentally witnessed Theta carrying documents down into the hidden room. Theta realized he had seen. She did not panic. She sat him down and asked him one thing: "Keep this between us." He had honored that request. But Theta had also given him something: a sealed envelope with instructions to deliver it to whoever inherited the house, but only when trouble arrived. "She told me I would know when the time was right," Alton said. "I think this is it." Dessa opened the envelope. Inside was a notarized copy of a letter Theta had sent to her personal attorney years before her death. The letter listed in specific detail the actions Sable had taken regarding family assets that concerned Theta. It included dates, descriptions, and references to supporting documents. At the bottom, Theta had written a single declarative sentence. If anyone challenges Dessa's inheritance, this document will prove that I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly why I was doing it. Dessa looked at Alton. He stood in her kitchen, a man who had spent months avoiding her because he was afraid of getting involved and who had walked through that fear, because he decided it was more important to keep his word to a dead woman than to protect his own peace. She thanked him. Then she asked if he would like to sit down and have coffee. He sat, and for the first time since Dessa had arrived in Tennessee, she shared a quiet morning with someone who had known Theta the way Theta deserved to be known. They did not talk about gold or legal disputes. They talked about the way Theta could make anyone feel welcome in any room. They talked about the garden she used to keep behind the barn. They talked about the sound of her laughter, which Alton said could carry across 2 fields on a summer evening. Dessa listened and felt for the first time in months that she was not carrying her mother's memory alone. The legal proceedings stretched across several months. The courtroom became a second home for Dessa, a place where she spent more mornings than she would have liked sitting beside Garnett, while strangers examined the private details of her family's history under fluorescent lights. Each hearing introduced new evidence that shifted the ground further away from Sable and Leland's position. Garnett presented Theta's audio recording made months before her death, in which she explained with complete clarity why she had distributed the inheritance the way she did. She confirmed that she had been fully aware of the gold deposit and that she had made her decision consciously and voluntarily. Her voice on the recording was steady and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had spent years preparing for a conversation she knew she would not be alive to have in person. The recording was accompanied by legal certifications of authenticity prepared years in advance, precisely to withstand future challenges. Corinne Breyer appeared as a witness, presenting her findings about Harlan Voss's activities and his connection to Leland Holbrook. She described the break-in at the barn and the surveillance of Dessa's property and the questioning of community residents by a man with a prior fraud conviction hired by the opposing counsel. Her testimony was delivered with the steady precision of someone who had built a case one fact at a time and was now laying each piece on the table for everyone to see. When the opposing counsel tried to suggest that Corinne had been influenced by personal sympathy for Dessa, the deputy responded with a single sentence that silenced the objection. "I followed the evidence, counselor. That is what I was trained to do." A former associate of Leland's also came forward, providing internal documents showing that the lawyer had been investigating the Kincaid family's land holdings long before Theta died, including inquiries related to old geological survey records. The revelation confirmed what Colton Yancey had warned Dessa about months earlier. Leland had not stumbled into this case by accident. He had been circling the Kincaid property for years, waiting for an opportunity to gain access to whatever lay beneath it. His gambling debts had simply accelerated the timeline. Leland's composure deteriorated with each session. The carefully constructed image of a disinterested professional crumbled as evidence revealed years of private research, financial desperation, and a willingness to use a convicted fraudster to do his fieldwork. By the final weeks of proceedings, his objections had grown desperate, his arguments thin, and his confidence visibly fractured. Then in the final hearing, something happened that no one in the room had predicted. Blythe Kincaid asked to speak. Sable turned to look at her sister with an expression that moved through shock, confusion, and fury in the space of a single breath. Blythe stood at her hands, gripping the edge of the table in front of her, her voice shaking but audible in every corner of the silent room. She admitted that she had known about the connection between Sable and Leland before Theta's death. She admitted that she had been aware of efforts to access family property records. She admitted that she had stayed silent for too long because she was afraid that speaking up would cost her the only close relationship she had left. "My mother was not unfair," Blythe said, and her voice steadied as she spoke those words, as though saying them out loud gave them a structural integrity that silence never could. "She knew exactly what she was doing, and I have wasted too much time refusing to admit that." The courtroom was silent for several seconds after she finished. Sable did not look at her. She sat perfectly still, her hands flat on the table in front of her, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall. It was the posture of someone who had just watched the last door close. Leland stared at the table. Garnett made no comment. He did not need to. Blythe's testimony had dismantled the last remaining pillar of the opposing argument. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. A reporter in the back row wrote furiously. The judge waited for someone to object. No one did. The ruling was decisive. The court confirmed that Theta's distribution of the inheritance was entirely valid. Dessa was declared the rightful owner of the house, the surrounding land, and all rights associated with the discovery beneath the property. Certain benefits Sable had obtained through previously undisclosed maneuvers were reviewed, adjusted, and in some cases reversed. Professional ethics investigations were opened against Leland Holbrook, and the findings would follow him for the rest of his career. When it was over, Dessa walked out of the building with Garnet beside her. Reporters called out questions. Cameras flashed. Dessa answered briefly, thanking those who had helped establish the truth. Then she left. Outside near the far edge of the parking lot, Blythe stood alone. She was not near Sable. She was not near Leland. She stood by herself, hands in her coat pockets, looking at the pavement. Dessa walked to her. The two women stood face to face for the first time, without pretense, without strategy, without the shadow of Sable, or the pressure of lawyers, or the noise of a courtroom between them. "I am sorry," Blythe said. "I should have spoken up a long time ago." "But you spoke up when it mattered," Dessa answered. They did not embrace. They did not make promises or plans. But something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that they were still sisters despite everything, and that it was not too late for that to mean something. Dessa returned to the property 2 days later. When she stepped out of the truck and looked at the house, the feeling that filled her was unlike anything she had experienced before. The walls had not changed. The paint was still peeling. The garden still needed work. But she saw the house differently now, not as a place that had been abandoned, but as a place that had been waiting for the right person to arrive, to find what had been hidden, to understand what had been protected, and to decide what came next. Every room she had searched, every document she had read, every sleepless night she had endured in this house had been part of a conversation she was having with a woman who was no longer alive. And now that conversation had finally reached its conclusion. She sat on the front porch for a long time that first evening back. The sun went down over the fields, and the crickets began their nightly chorus, and the air turned cool and still. Dessa thought about everything that had happened since the morning of the will reading, the day she had walked into a notary's office, expecting fairness, and walked out feeling like she had been left behind. She could see now that she had not been left behind at all. She had been sent ahead. She hired workers from the community to begin restoring the structure. She wanted the project to benefit the people who had lived near this land for generations without ever knowing what lay beneath it. Roofs were repaired. Walls were reinforced. Original details were preserved wherever possible. The old porch was rebuilt using the same style of railing that appeared in the earliest photographs Dessa had found in the hidden compartment. When the new flower pots went up along the rail, Maren Pruitt was the first person to notice. She stood at the edge of the road for a full minute looking at the porch, then told Dessa that it looked exactly the way it had when Theta was alive. Each stage of progress drew interest from neighbors who had watched the property sit empty for years. People who had once driven past without a second glance now stopped to watch the work, to ask questions, to offer help. A retired carpenter named Willis, who lived 3 miles south, showed up one morning with his own tools and spent 2 weeks restoring the front door frame without asking for payment. When Dessa tried to pay him, he shook his head and said Theta had given his wife a winter coat during a hard year, and he had never had the chance to return the kindness. But the restoration was only the beginning. Dessa began meeting with residents of the community. She sat in kitchens and on porches and in the back room of Maren's store listening to their needs. She discovered families who had been searching for stable work for years, driving 40 or 50 miles each way to jobs that paid barely enough to cover the gas. She met elderly people living alone in houses that needed repairs they could not afford, eating meals they stretched across 2 days to make them last. She found young people who wanted to continue their education but had no way to pay for it, and no one in their lives who had ever been to college. Each conversation reminded her of something Theta used to say, that opportunities change lives when they reach the right people. Dessa transformed part of the property into a productive space that generated permanent employment. She brought in specialists to develop activities compatible with the region's environment and economy. She established training workshops for people seeking new skills. Everything from equipment operation to bookkeeping to agricultural techniques adapted for the Tennessee Hill Country. Dozens of families began to benefit directly. Neighbors who had traveled long distances for work now found opportunities within sight of their own front porches. She converted another section of the land into a community center. Programs for elderly residents, educational services, and support for families facing financial hardship filled the building within months. The idea had come to her while looking through old photographs of Theda. Her mother had always possessed a gift for helping others. Dessa wanted to honor that legacy in the most concrete way she could. She named the center after no one. There was no plaque with the Kincaid name, no dedication ceremony, no ribbon cutting with cameras. She simply opened the doors one morning and let the people who needed it most walk through them. Within a year, the center had become the quiet heart of the community. On any given Tuesday, you might find a retired school teacher helping a teenager with college applications in one room, while a group of elderly men played cards and argued about weather patterns in another. Dessa often sat in the main hall during the late afternoon when the light came through the tall windows and the sounds of different conversations blended together into something that resembled more than anything else she could think of the noise of a family gathering. One afternoon, while walking through the center, accompanied by several community members, a woman approached her. She was perhaps 40 with tired eyes and calloused hands, and she spoke quietly as though she was not accustomed to being heard. She explained that the programs Dessa had created had provided help during the most difficult period of her life. Her husband had been injured in a logging accident 2 years earlier, and the family had been on the edge of losing their home. The training program had given her skills that led to steady work for the first time in years. Before leaving, the woman took Dessa's hands and said something that stayed with Dessa for weeks afterward. Theda would be proud. Dessa did not respond immediately. She looked down at the woman's hands holding hers and felt a sentence move through her like sunlight through a window she had forgotten was there. Sable reorganized her life after the legal proceedings. She spent a period blaming others for what had happened. She blamed Leland for his miscalculations. She blamed Blythe for her betrayal. She blamed the judge for not understanding what she called the full picture. But gradually over months that turned into a year, and then 2. She began to acknowledge, at least privately, that her own decisions had led to the outcome. Her relationship with Blythe fractured during the months of conflict and never fully recovered. With Dessa, contact remained minimal. There were no ongoing arguments, no public confrontations. They simply walked different paths. Several months after the trial, Dessa received a short handwritten letter from Blythe. It did not contain apologies or explanations. It said only this: "I remember the summers at that house. I'm glad you are living there now." Dessa read it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer where she kept Theda's letters. She stood beside the drawer for a moment with her hand resting on the wooden surface. Then she returned to her work. Years passed. The community around the property grew and prospered. The restored house became a landmark in the region. Visitors came to learn the story. Some wanted to see where it all began. Others simply admired the transformation that had taken place in a part of Tennessee that most maps barely acknowledged. Local newspapers wrote about it. A television crew from Knoxville drove out once and filmed a short piece that aired on the evening news. Dessa declined to be interviewed on camera, but she stood on the porch and watched them film the house, in the barn, in the community center, and she thought about how strange it was that a place everyone once called worthless had become the thing people traveled to see. Dessa built new friendships with the families she had helped. The people who worked on the property became part of her daily life. Marin brought baked goods every Sunday and stayed for coffee. Alton stopped by most mornings on his walk, never staying long, never saying much, but always there. Corinne drove past the property on her patrols and sometimes pulled over to wave. Without realizing it, Dessa had built a new family around herself. Not a family of blood, but a family of shared purpose, built one conversation, one meal, one difficult morning at a time. One autumn afternoon, several years after the discovery, Dessa was sorting through old boxes in a back room of the house. Between photographs, letters, and family keepsakes, she found something she had completely forgotten: a small digital memory card inside a sealed envelope. The label bore a single line in Theda's handwriting: "When the time comes." Dessa found a device to play it. Minutes later, an image appeared on the screen. Theda sitting in the kitchen of this very house. The date on the recording showed it had been made several years before her death. She was older in the video than in any of the photographs Dessa had found, but her eyes were the same, clear, warm, certain. Dessa felt her throat tighten. It was like hearing a voice she had trained herself to stop expecting. She pressed her hand against the screen for a moment, as though she could reach through the glass and touch her mother's face. Then she pulled her hand back and let Theda speak. Theda smiled at the camera and began speaking. She said she had prepared this message to be watched only after all the pieces were in place. She said she hoped Dessa had found the truth. She said she hoped Dessa understood why certain decisions had been made. She paused then, and for a few seconds looked away from the camera the way she always did when she was gathering her thoughts for something important. When she looked back, her eyes were bright. Then Theda leaned forward slightly, the way she always did when she was about to say the thing she had been thinking about longest. She said she had watched her 3 daughters carefully for many years. She knew each of them had strengths. She knew each of them had weaknesses. She knew that life had tested all 3 in different ways. But she also knew something else. Something she had carried in silence, because it was not the kind of knowledge you could share until the moment proved it true. The real test was never about who deserved the most money. The real test was who would be capable of doing something good when given the opportunity. That was why she did not leave the greatest treasure to the daughter with the most business experience. She did not leave it to the one who sought to accumulate more wealth. She left it to the one who had always shown gratitude even when she received little. She left it to the one who valued memories as much as material possessions. She left it to the one who continued helping others even when no one was watching. Theda paused. She looked directly into the camera, and for a moment it felt as though she was looking through the screen and across the years and straight into the kitchen where Dessa sat alone. "I chose you," Theda said, "because I knew you would choose them." Tears moved down Dessa's face. They were not tears of grief. They were the kind of tears that come when something you have carried for a very long time is finally set down and you realize it was not a burden at all. It was a gift you did not know you were holding. The recording ended. The screen went dark. The kitchen was silent. Dessa lifted her eyes to the window. The sun was lowering behind the same fields she had known as a child. The same fields Nolan had protected with a system of secrets and hiding places. The same fields Theda had guarded with letters and clues, and the fierce, quiet love of a mother who had planned decades ahead to make sure the right daughter found the right truth at the right time. The light came through the glass and filled the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Dessa sat in that light and felt something she had not felt since the morning she received the phone call telling her that Theda was gone. It was not nostalgia. It was not sadness. It was not relief. It was the certainty that Theda had never really left. She was present in every decision Dessa had made since opening the door of this house for the first time. She was present in every family that found work because Dessa chose to build rather than hoard. She was present in every child who walked into the community center and found something they needed. She was present in Blythe's quiet letter, in Alton's morning coffee, in Marin's box of baked goods, and Corinne's steady sense of justice. She was present in the old clock that still read 6:20, in the portrait that had guarded a secret for years in the barn, that held the truth beneath its floor, and in every step of the long, winding, improbable road that had carried Dessa from an inheritance everyone called unfair to a life filled with purpose, connection, and the kind of happiness that does not depend on what you own, but on what you choose to do with what you have been given. Dessa placed her hand flat on the kitchen table, the same table where she had opened Theda's letters, where she had studied Nolan's notebook, where she had nearly given up and almost called Leland Holbrook to say yes. She pressed her palm against the worn wood and closed her eyes. "Thank you, Mom," she said. The house was quiet. The fields were gold in the evening light. And somewhere in the silence between the last word and the first star of the night, Dessa Kincaid knew that this was exactly where she was meant to be.